Thank you, and we really appreciate your being here today, and we very much appreciate having our special guest, Loomis, here today for our colloquium. She inaugurates a very special series, the John J. Curran 75 Lectures in Journalism series, which, because of the beneficence of his widow, Joan Curran, whom we're very lucky to have here tonight as well, we will have this wonderful opportunity going into the future here at Bard. It is in honor of this very important alum, John Curran, 75. His dedication to ethical reporting and journalism informed a trusting readership for more than a quarter of a century. And these values that we hold at Bard so dearly of honesty and integrity is something that is very highly affiliated with his memory. And this is why we are especially excited that we will have many such opportunities and such a very special inauguration with Carol Loomis, about whom Wyatt Mason will now tell you much more. Thank you so much.
It's a true privilege to have the chance to talk to you today about Carol Loomis. I want to read to you, to start, a little bit of her writing. And so I'm going to start with something from a 2005 essay she wrote for Fortune on someone who's in the news now, Carly Fiorina, who's running for president. And we've heard in the press lots about her term at Hewlett-Packard. And so I think it's worthwhile reading this prescient piece from 10 years ago. After introducing in a few paragraphs this executive's rise to prominence, one of the first very powerful female CEOs in business and tech, we have this closing paragraph to an introductory section of this 7,000-word article. 7,000 words seems to be a length that Carol knows how to use in a powerful and unforgettable way. So here's this paragraph. Celebrity, as everyone knows, isn't an achievement in itself. Beneath the public image are the yardsticks against which executives are and should be measured. So is it right to ask whether this whirlwind, Fiorina and her rise, whether this whirlwind has succeeded? And inevitably that question must be answered in two parts. First, under the only lens that matters, did the famed merger that Fiorina engineered between HP and Compaq produce value for HP's shareholders? Second, with that merger nearly 3 years past, is HP in shape to thrive in its brutally competitive world? The answers are no and doubtful. This is only the beginning of what I said is a 7,000-word piece, which investigates very complex matters of business that frankly are typically beyond me. But one of the things I notice when reading about derivatives or any of the complex devices and financial figures that are always the subject of her reporting in Fortune, I actually feel briefly as though I understand these things. And that is a feeling that actually stays with the reader afterwards. You actually are educated by reading a Loomis piece on a complex financial feature. And also the people involved are never forgotten, nor does one ever forget that they are people. The very end of the piece on Fiorina, which is on many things, American business and presumption and so many features of that complex series of transactions, we get another paragraph towards the end in which things are put in context. So the CEO's job at HP is exceptionally difficult, perhaps beyond the ability of anyone to handle well. Still, the latest proxy available for 2003 shows that Fiorina was paid around $7 million in cash and options. It's therefore fair to hold her to a high standard. Fortune asked a dedicated supporter of someone who lost out on a different point of view on the merger, Walter Hewlett, an heir, in the proxy fight whether some other CEO could be doing better than Fiorina in handling HP's problems. Calling that a good question, he proceeded to go all around the barn, and note that language there, to go all around the barn. Quote, "She's a very, very smart, competent, talented executive," he said. But then he hammered on some faults, and we see that barn and someone hammering on it with actually a rude instrument. Mainly her inability, he thought, to admit she was wrong in getting herself trapped in computer land. Note that prescience of the idea of someone who would failed to admit she might have been wrong. That sounds like an American politician. She cannot bite the bullet and say, we lost. Other businessmen, and here Loomis interjects, slip of the tongue. Fiorina is, of course, not a businessman. Can do that and move on. She can't. What I see in an article like this is someone who is never failing to realize that language is at the service of attempting to educate us on what other people do, what they're like, what their instincts are, and what their aims might be, and how they often fall short of those aims. For this in business, Carol has been called the greatest business reporter in history, and I think that that actually isn't sufficient. She's genuinely one of the best journalists in the American tradition. As she is famous for, she has worked and now retired in 2014. She worked for 60 years at Fortune. She was one of two women who were working there in the 1950s as researchers who became one of the two earliest writers there who were women. And that late paragraph moment, slip of the tongue, referring to the fact that a contemporary businessman would still refer to a woman in business as a businessman, shows dedicatedly an attention to the idea that if we're writing about business, we can't ignore the business of men and women doing that business and being reimbursed and paid and treated unequally. Carol was born June 25th, 1929, not a heavily guarded fact. It's out there. She's recently turned 86. She went to Drury College, graduated from the University of Missouri with a Bachelor of Journalism in 1951. Worked for 2 years for the Maytag Corporation at their magazine, and then began her 60-year tenure writing for Fortune. As of 2014, she'd won 28 major awards for journalism. Her Lifetime Achievement Award, the first of 3 or 4 Lifetime Achievement Awards that she won was back in 1993. That's when the first one was. I want to mention something that from this article. I hold it up. This is a totem from 1966, Personal Investing, a column about a man named Alfred Winslow Jones, in which Carol coined the term hedge fund. Comes in this paragraph, which is written about Alfred Winslow Jones, about whom she writes, the vehicle, and this is typical of her writing about how finance works. It's exceedingly clear. The vehicle through which Jones operates is not a mutual fund, but a limited partnership. Jones runs 2 such partnerships, and they have slightly different investment objectives. In each case, however, the underlying investment strategy is the same. The fund's capital is both leveraged and hedged. The leverage arises from the fact that the fund margins itself to the hilt. The hedge is provided by short positions. There are always some in the fund's portfolio. There are about 60 investors in each of the 2 funds, and their average investment now works out to about, at that time, $460,000. In the course of this, we get to an understanding of how this hedge works, and then 4 years later, we get a devastating article, also by Carol, about how hedge funds also don't work, how they're dangerous, how this is risky, how this could go bad. And one of the things, if you read through her body of work, or what is available of it online, is one sees a conversation she is having with the business culture over the course of a half century, which is a mindful conversation about how things work, how things don't work, and how the country can be afflicted by it. I want to read you a few openings to a couple other of her pieces before I cede the floor to Carol. These will not touch on finance, but just simply the qualities of a writer that would make their work read for 60 years. I want to give you a quote from Carol from the Columbia Journalism Review when she gave an interview to them, in which she gives us the following advice, essentially. After my first story, she told the interviewer, which wasn't very good, I got absolutely rabid about collecting every fact I could before I interviewed anybody. I believe that if you've done your homework, then about 1 minute into the interview, they don't even notice whether you're a man or a woman. They realize that they are talking to someone who paid them the compliment of studying up for the interview. So the knowledge base that Carol brings to everything she writes about isn't ginned up for the occasion of the article. She really knows what she's talking about. in the case of the article on derivatives, 7,000 words, I actually understood it at the end of it because, like any really good professor, she teaches because she understands. So here's an article that begins to give us a sense of what she understands about writing. I understand that if I had a stapler, it would have made my task much easier because I would not be fumbling here for the next page. But I have it. To all generally well-informed business people, begins her 7,000 words on derivatives, a few words of semi-comfort about financial derivatives. First, if you don't really understand what these are, don't fret. Most of your colleagues, top brass included, are equally baffled. Second, if 10 years from now, despite periodic booster shots from articles like this one, you still can't keep these things in focus, then cheer. That will mean derivatives have not been forcibly brought to your attention by bad news, in which they make headlines as a villain, or even the villain, in some financial crisis that sweeps the world. 1994. In 2000, an article begins on the merger of AOL and Time Warner. Frankly, wrote a JP Morgan securities analyst just after the AOL-Time Warner merger was announced, it is difficult to project the true potential of this new entity, but we know it is big, unquote. That statement might not get far in a logic class, but it rather nicely captures the widespread confusion about the payoff in this deal. The murkiness won't be dispelled soon. 7,000 words later, we get to the end of it, and it is a highly critical take on this merger, which, of course, is before many of your thinking. However, what isn't lost on us is the fact that at the time, Fortune magazine was owned by Time Warner. And so this extremely critical article was written by someone who was actually getting a paycheck from that corporation. So that is what we might mean by fearless when we're talking about speaking truth to the culture. It would be remiss of me were I not to mention the unique relationship that Carol has had for a half century with Warren Buffett, one of America's most progressive and important business people and investors, and chairman of Berkshire Hathaway. She has spoken on the phone to him pretty much every day for over 40 years. And Buffett has said of Carol, Carol is one of the few people who is smarter at the end of every day than she was at the beginning of it. She has a reverence for facts, and then she makes them understandable and fun to read. You always wish her stories were longer. That's the sign of a great writer. One of Carol's endeavors over the years has been to serve not just as Buffett's conversational foil, but also as his editor and as a collaborator in conversation and in Buffett's own prose. And there's so much lip service that you get from people about saying how great other people are, especially the famous seem particularly fatuous, but Buffett's claims for Carol are borne out by everything I've read that she's written. It bears the mark of a kind of lucidity that only comes from comprehension, full comprehension, and that she's able to convey that in a medium which many of us find baffling is incredibly useful and something for which we're enormously grateful. I would ask you to join your hands together and welcome Carol Loomis to the stage to deliver this inaugural lecture.
I'm a bit overwhelmed by that. I better get in front of that. I hate to say I'm left speechless because that would not augur well for the next 40 minutes. However, that really was the nicest introduction I've ever had. Somebody actually read my stuff. Now, it's not the word stuff is trouble these days, but we've been hearing about one politician who spoke of stuff happens. But anyway, I can't tell you how much I admire the work you put into that. That was amazing. Thank you very much. Now, I'm just delighted to be here today as the first speaker in a program honoring a 1975 graduate of Bard, John Curran, John and I worked together at Time Incorporated's Fortune magazine for almost 20 years. That was only 1/3 of my career, but that was a good third. And for me, that was a great privilege to work with him. I myself, does this need to come down? I was anticipating that. Okay, that's better. Thank you. I would, when I was at Fortune that long time, I would from time to time run into someone outside the company who would say to me, "Oh, you work at Fortune, do you know?" And I would interrupt that person because it was almost certain that I knew that person, but because hundreds of people went through Fortune during that long time that I was there. But many of those people did not in the least stick firmly in my mind, and there is no question but that John Curran did. He came to Fortune in 1979 when I'd already been there for 25 years and was a senior writer. Fortune's practice then, and for all the years I'd been there, was to assign a writer, that was me, and what we called a researcher, though that title was officially then being replaced by reporter, to every important story, what we called a middle-of-the-book story. Very soon after John's arrival, he was assigned to work with me on a story about a significant financial measure for corporations called return on shareholders' equity. Probably don't teach about that too much at Bard, but not all Fortune stories are heavily statistical by any means, but this one definitely was. And John worked in the trenches for weeks pulling out the statistics we needed while I interviewed chief executive officers about their focus or lack of it on this vital concept. I then wrote a rather nerdish piece that I was happy about, but that probably did not get read by a multitude of Fortune readers. But one reader, thank heavens, who noticed it in a big way was the chief executive officer of our own company, our parent company, Nick Nicholas. He told our managing editor that he had never before understood the importance of return on equity, in fact, had hardly heard of the term, and wanted to see every manager in the company get a copy of the piece. He then proceeded to overorder copies. I certainly remember that, and John and I ended up with extras in our office that we were still trying to get rid of when we ended our careers at Fortune. Working with John on that story, I got to know what a great guy and journalist he was. He never complained about all that heavy statistical work. He contributed all sorts of ideas for the story, which was exactly what good researchers were supposed to do, and overall showed that he had an abundance of the three qualities that I've always thought were essential at Fortune. To succeed there, you have to be smart, you have to be able to get along with people, and have immense amounts of curiosity. John was an exemplar of those qualities. And I came to think that an important part of his ability could be traced back to Bard. Being a Midwesterner myself and small townish to boot, I had never heard of Bard when I met John. He filled me in with the zest of a recruiter. He talked about the writing track that was so important at the school and described his college experience as just about perfect. Today, seeing the campus for the first time, I can imagine him with his dark, handsome looks at the school. He made his experience at Fortune close to perfect, too. He moved from researcher to writer to junior editor to senior editor. And before long, he was editing me because I had by choice stayed as a writer, and he was awfully good at the job. He had a reputation for being a tough taskmaster, but in my opinion, that was just because he was driven by high standards, some of which I can see just from having been here about an hour. As far as his being my editor, I remember especially one story I did about those same financial derivatives, newly notorious in the mid-90s when I did the story. The heart of the story was fine when I turned in my first draft, and the ending worked well, but I just could not get the lead right. And John stepped in and gave me a fully thought-out suggestion of what the beginning should be. And today, when I look at that story, which was the second story I did on derivatives, not the one previously mentioned, when I look at that story, because it sort of became famous because nobody else besides Fortune was writing about this near impenetrable subject, there's my byline on it. But when I look at it, I always look at the lead and say, John Curran did that. He is deeply missed by me and all of his close friends he made at Time Inc. In my remarks today, I'd like to tell you a little bit about how I myself ended up at Fortune, what I did there, which highly oversimplified can be described as holding conversations with business leaders and writing about what they said. Though you may not be able to stretch your imagination quite this far, 65 years ago, I was in the same position as many of you students are today. I was at the beginning of my senior year at a good college. Mine was the University of Missouri. I had spent a lot of time learning how to write, specializing in magazine journalism, and I had no idea what kind of job I might get or whether I could even get one. I was an only child, and I remember meeting my parents at a gasoline station midway between my hometown and the University of Missouri at Columbia, and trying to talk my parents into letting me go to New York when I graduated and look there for a job. I had never been to New York, of course, and that was just one of the reasons they thought I had better dial back some and look for a job closer to home. A few months later, with my graduation just around the corner, I got lucky. An alum of the University of Missouri was putting on a house organ at the Maytag Company in Iowa. A house organ, in case you don't know, because it's not a term you hear too often these days, is a company publication, and this one was a 24-page monthly magazine that went to Maytag dealers. This alum, and never forget that out there are all these Bard graduates in the working world to call on. This alum needed an assistant editor, and he got the journalism school to pick out 3 prospects for him. He came down, and I and 2 of my friends flew with him in a Maytag plane. None of us had ever been in a private plane, and were interviewed at the company's headquarters in Newton, Iowa. I always thought that I was helped in that job situation by the fact that I came from a town of only 1,000 people and could relate to Newton, a bigger but still small town. Anyway, I got the job. Later succeeded the editor when he chose to leave the company, and spent more than 2 years flying around the country interviewing successful Maytag dealers, photographing them with a speed graphic, and putting out this magazine, the Maytag News. But all this time, I had not forgotten my wish to be in New York. So I came to the city on vacation in 1953 and wangled interviews at the magazine spot I most wished to be, Time Incorporated, and was interviewed by the heads of research at Time, Life, and Fortune. Time and Life didn't like me. Fortune, noting that good business experience at Maytag, did. But the head of the research there didn't have a job opening, she said, and told me she'd be in touch if she did. I went back to Newton, not sure at all that she was leveling with me about that. It's easy to say I don't have any opening. But a month later, I got a letter from her saying that the next time I was in New York, now that was a hoot, I should drop in and see her. I got the letter when I came home from work on a Thursday evening, called her first thing next morning, and on Monday morning at 9 o'clock was at Fortune's offices. By 10 o'clock, I had the job. The woman who hired me later told me that sprint to New York was a big factor in her decision to offer me the job. A few weeks later, I was at Fortune and into a job that was pretty close to heaven for any young journalist with a long attention span, which described me. The internet didn't yet remotely exist. Print was the medium. Fortune then wrote only long stories, and leaving aside people from the art and photography departments, though you couldn't leave them really aside because they were very important, but otherwise these stories were done by 3 people: a two-person team that reported and created the story, and an editor who weighed in, sometimes very heavily. The two-person team was that writer and researcher I've mentioned earlier. Just think of the researcher as a reporter, which is the word we were trending to. And the time span for a story could easily be 2 months. All the writers but one were men, and all of the reporters were women. That was my job. It was the entry job. The reporters, there were more than 20 of us, went with the writers to interview businessmen, and men was undeniably the correct word at that time, and we were responsible for typing up detailed notes of the interview and for the ultimate accuracy of what was printed. I loved my job from the start. It was a continual learning experience, not only because you were interviewing people like IBM's Thomas Watson and the head of the Panama Canal, and that you were doing down in Panama, but you were seeing how the writers, most of them with long experience, did their questioning and got the information they needed. It was a humbling second seat to be in because you didn't see how you could ever have the intelligence to think of the questions they did, or to be sharp in recognizing and possibly challenging answers that were weak. Ultimately, I realized I was seeing decades of experience on display, and I began to feel less intimidated. But it didn't make any difference what I felt anyway, because reporters weren't promoted to writers. After all, we were women, and in the time-incorporated system, when women didn't write. And I must say, I was not discontented nor offended in the least by the system. I was having too much fun in my reporting job. Then in a few years, I was promoted to an administrative position, assistant chief of research, and in that job helped manage our brand new Fortune 500, started in 1955. I did okay at that. From the start, financial statements and accounting made sense to me. And then one day, my managing editor called me in to tell me we were starting a new investment series and then a monthly investment column, and that he wanted to make me one of the two writers on both the series and column. I did what women aren't supposed to do. I said ridiculous things like, "Are you sure? Women don't write, do they?" But he forgave me that, and in 1962, 8 years after I arrived at Fortune, I started writing. I feel that one of the things different from the young people of that day and today is that the young people today are generally in more of a hurry. It just is the way that the world has worked out. I was then also 8 years out of small Missouri and Iowa towns where I grew up, and I had my only other job, that one at Maytag. And all the evidence suggests I was not a sophisticated woman of the world. Writing an article for the new investment column about how to think about gold, I interviewed a Wall Streeter named Franz Pick, who told me that though Americans weren't then allowed to buy gold, they did it anyway by going to Canada and buying there. I expressed my amazement that Americans would be such lawbreakers. And Franz Pick looked at me and said, "What are you, a mental virgin?" Well, I stuck that in my memory book and went on to many conversations with business leaders, many of them. Among the students who are here, I don't imagine that there are more than a handful who are interested in business journalism, although I know from the John Curran experience that you can be interested in that here. But I will argue that it can be a fascinating trade. The people you deal with are, for the most part, highly intelligent people with interesting, important stories to tell. The obverse point is that sometimes, in fact very often, they do not care to tell you their failings. Imagine interviewing Volkswagen, for example, or going back, imagine interviewing Bernie Madoff. So often you have to bear down on detective work to pull out the full story, but that's part of the fun. And what business journalists have going for them generally is that business people love talking about their businesses. So if you grant them the respect of being well prepared for your interview and generally coming across as a professional trying to do a good job, you are apt to have long and very interesting conversations. When I was doing what we at Fortune called a corporation story, that is a deep look at a major company at a transforming or difficult moment in its history, I would ask the company's public relations head for 1.5 hours with the CEO at the beginning of a story, and next for interviews with the important executives just below him, and then for a return interview with the CEO at the end of a story. So it was Chairman David Rockefeller, for example, I wanted to talk to in 1977 when he was 3 years away from retirement as head of Chase Bank, was running all over the world, being America's foremost international statesman, and perhaps partly because of that globe-trotting, was not turning out good results at the bank. I must say, interviewing Rockefeller at the bank's headquarters in downtown Manhattan was a little intimidating. Here was John D's grandson sitting across from you, a virtual wing of the Modern Museum of Art in view, and on your question list, a few he wasn't going to like. And then over the next few days, I did my thing of interviewing his top officers, the head of real estate, of corporate lending, of consumer lending. And a couple of people I talked to said that David the boss was also intimidating for them, a formidable presence when you wanted to make some non-traditional proposal for improving the bank. So when I went back to David Rockefeller for my long closing interview, I told him that story, not using any names. I told him that some people who worked for him were a little scared of him. "Do I scare you?" he said. And I answered, "Yes, a little." I then wrote that anecdote into the story we call the three-year deadline at David's bank, and half of the anecdote was published. Rockefeller's "Do I scare you?" question made it, but my editor cut my answer because he preferred to argue that I wasn't really scared, which wasn't totally the truth. And by the way, David Rockefeller, who turned 100 this past summer, did a fine job of shaping up the bank in the 3 years he had to do it and retired with Chase in good shape. We didn't exactly have beats at Fortune, but over the next few days, I talked to and wrote a lot about bankers who were business leaders, particularly at Citigroup and Bankers Trust. At Citi, the CEOs I interviewed started with Walter Wriston and went through John Reed, Sandy Weil, Chuck Prince, and Vikram Pandit. The first time I met Wriston was at a Citi dinner for the press, where I sat by him. Making light conversation, I asked him whether he watched television. He said yes, and that his favorite program was The $6 Million Man. For those of you too young to remember, that was Lee Majors playing the Bionic Man. It was such a surprising choice that I asked Wriston what he liked about the program, and he said, "Well, it's just so Guinea." Well, the only meaning I knew for Guinea was that it was an Italian slur, so I decided to nod knowingly and move on to some other subject. Of all of Citi's CEOs that I knew, I thought John Reed was probably the most fascinating to talk to. He didn't like to give interviews, in part because his Puritan ethic told him it wasn't seemly to play the public relations game. The handful of interviews I got, though, were a journalist's delight because Reed was both intellectually interesting and constitutionally unable to be anything but candid. Except on one point, I have to add. When I reluctantly asked Reed in 1991 whether the public rumors were true that he was involved with a flight attendant on Citi's payroll, he simply chose not to answer. He and the flight attendant were married 3 years later. Despite his obvious intelligence, I never thought John Reed was a particularly good businessman, which put him in rough ground after Citicorp and Travelers merged in 2008, and he and Sandy Weil became the co-CEOs of the renamed company called Citigroup. Now, I think that co-CEOs is a disaster, a recipe for disaster in most situations. And indeed, here the arrangement didn't last for long because Reed and Weil began to battle, and it was clear that one of them was going to have to go. I suspected Sandy Weil's street smarts would best John Reed's intellect. And I bet 50 cents with the CEO of a Wall Street firm that Weil would win, which is indeed how it turned out. Years later, after Weil had retained the post of chairman but turned over the job of CEO to Chuck Prince, I wrote a short piece about what the state of semi-retirement was like for Sandy. He was still in a city office, but was deeply bored. He was also sort of imprisoned because Citi still had big legal problems imposed on the company by then New York Attorney General Eliot Spitzer. Worried about the legal problems, Sandy, who always struggled with his weight, had told me a year or so earlier that he had gone on what he called the Eliot Spitzer diet. No martinis, no bread, no desserts. I asked him now on this news story whether he was still on the diet, and he said, "I'm still not eating bread or desserts." Now, in my reporting life, I could only recall two businessmen being visibly angry at me, close to yelling, in fact. One was Charlie Sanford, CEO of Bankers Trust, who invented, quote, "a whole new way to run a bank." That was the title of our early 1990 story, and didn't like to be asked questions about the bank being innovative because he thought that word sent the price of his stock down. Beyond that, what really got his temper up was tough questions about those then newfangled instruments, financial derivatives that were so important at the bank. The other angry man was the chief financial officer of Sears Roebuck, Jack somebody, I've mercifully blanked out his name, whom I was interviewing for a story that came to be called The Leaning Tower of Sears. You can see that we had sometimes had pretty tough titles. And who thought my questions showed I had not done enough accounting homework for the story. I actually think he was right about that, so took his displays of temper well. Jack's PR man, who was sitting in on the interview, was, of course, horrified. Carl Icahn, still a person in the news today, I sort of feel like I've grown up with him, was not a yeller, but he remains the most argumentative person I have ever interviewed and written about. My Icahn year was 1986, and the story was about Icahn's taking over the airline TWA. Icahn's initial reaction was to be thrilled about the takeover. When it became clear that he had beat out Frank Lorenzo for the airline, Icahn put on a pilot's cap and pranced around his office saying, "We got ourselves an airline." But the fact is he had a Pyrrhic victory because TWA, along with the whole airline industry, was in bad shape. None of that kept him from calling me up at every conceivable hour, 11 o'clock at night in my home, and first thing in the morning, and vehemently arguing the smallest of points about what he thought I was going to write. When the time came to write a headline for my story, my editor thought it should be a fill-in-the-blank situation, the blank of Carl Icahn. My editor also thought we should ask Carl what his choice of words should be. And Carl mulled that over with obvious interest and then called me at daybreak to say he thought it should be The Challenge of Carl Icahn. That would have been a boring title, of course. My editor came up with a much, much better word, The Comeuppance of Carl Icahn, and that's what we published. A subdued way of arguing, of course, is for a businessman to simply refuse to talk to fortune. Among those who adopted that strategy with me was John Malone of cable TV fame, Henry Kravis and George Roberts of KKR. When I sought to do a story in the 1980s, when few people understood the leveraged buyout business, later rechristened the private equity business, and quite recently, Tim Cook at Apple, whose huge accumulation of cash, $165 billion, we wish to write about. We did all of those stories anyway. You have to, if the story is sufficiently important. I would never argue that those companies made the wrong decision in deciding not to cooperate. I frankly don't know if they did or not. But the downside for a company in not cooperating is that the writer has much more time than he or she would usually have to comb the woods for outside and very important sources and for fresh information, and also has no inside interviews that encourage the writer to build a friendly feeling about the company. In any case, we ended up very satisfied that we had done all of those articles. Tim Cook, of course, makes me think of his famous predecessor, Steve Jobs. I never interviewed Steve for a story, but our tech writers did. And he was, in general, a holy pain for the managing editors of Fortune to deal with because he was so angrily opinionated about Apple and pretty close to abusive when he would call to tell a managing editor we couldn't possibly say something or other. My one time of meeting him was in 2007, when he and a team came into Fortune to show us the new product Apple was about to introduce, the iPhone. He had us all pull out our phones, mine was flip top, still is, and put them on the table, and then he put down iPhones by each one. They were a pretty spectacular contrast. But the conversation at that meeting included other topics, among them the fact that Apple was being investigated by the SEC for backdating stock options, the better to make them pay off for executives. Steve Jobs told us that day that the SEC had cleared Apple of wrongdoing. I didn't see how that could be true, because if the SEC had officially cleared Apple, that would have been a material fact, a good fact in this instance, that the company would have had to publicly announce and certainly would have wanted to. So I challenged what Steve had said. He glowered at me and repeated that the fact was accurate. We'll never know what the absolutely true case was because the SEC didn't subsequently make any kind of public statement about Apple's options, but it never brought any charges either. Another CEO with whom I had a sort of running argument is Jack Welch, who is, of course, celebrated, and rightly so in many ways, for his years of running GE. I've always had friendly relations with Jack, and my husband and I are right now residents of the same community, Lost Tree, Florida community, Lost Tree, where he and his wife are. But I have said in Fortune that there is one thing he and I do not agree about, and that is the managing and smoothing of earnings that he carried on at GE for most of his long career as CEO. He says I'm wrong. What investor, he asks, would want to buy a conglomerate like GE unless its earnings are predictable? Neither of us has ever budged from our positions. At Fortune, furthermore, I had a sort of pulpit for sermonizing about managed earnings or any kind of accounting wrongdoing, and I grabbed at every opportunity to write critically about companies, in my opinion, misbehaved. So I wrote misbehaving stories, for example, about American Express, Aetna, and Reynolds Tobacco. At the time I wrote about Reynolds, I was doing interviews on that story, which concerned a misbegotten practice called trade loading or channel loading, with the help of a young reporter, Mark Kolodny, who noticed as he took notes of our interviews with Reynolds CEO Jim Johnston that Johnston was feverishly smoking. Mark told me after the interview that Johnston had smoked 9 cigarettes in our 2-hour interview. Now, that was a journalistically irresistible fact, and it naturally made its way into the story. I noticed the other day in a newspaper story that executives in Portugal can be legally charged with ruinous management. We probably should have that in the U.S. At any rate, I saw a lot of ruinous management while working for Fortune. Here, though, I would need to concede that my views on what's ruinous were hardened by my long friendship with Warren Buffett, who's far too rational to engage in any kind of accounting maneuver or earnings management. He would regard these as simply ways to ultimately reduce what a company makes. To explain how Buffett became a friend, we can go back to 1967 when my husband John, then working for a Wall Street firm called Faulkner, Dawkins & Sullivan, made a sales call on Warren in Omaha. Warren was then little known outside Omaha, But John came back from his trip saying, "I think I just may have met the smartest investor in the country." I figure I probably rolled my eyes, as wives do when their husbands lapse into superlatives. But then I met Warren and his late first wife, Susie, when they asked us to have lunch in Manhattan. And I quickly came to think that John was absolutely right. Neither of us have since changed our mind. We have been Berkshire shareholders for more than 40 years, and I have indeed, as you heard, been editor of his annual letter, pro bono, because I don't take any pay for this, and I have been editor of his annual letter to shareholders for 38 years. I have also written extensively about him in Fortune, always acknowledging that I'm a friend of Warren's, a shareholder in Berkshire, and the editor of his letter. And 2 years ago, I published a book, Tap Dancing to Work, compiling all of Fortune's big articles about Buffett. Above all, I learned from Warren through innumerable conversations. You can think of them as mini interviews about business and investing. In that respect, I have simply been the luckiest business journalist alive. The prime talent that the CEOs of major companies need is an ability to allocate capital, and that is Warren's genius. His brilliance has allowed him to build Berkshire Hathaway, a gnat when he took it over, into the fourth largest U.S. company, and it is apt to climb another notch or two before he's finished. Warren Buffett will be in the history books 100 years from now, of that I'm sure. But he has so greatly broadened his influence in the past 10 years that I'm not sure then how he will be described by historians. I don't know whether he then will be identified primarily as an investor, as a manager, or as a philanthropist, one who has so far given away about $20 billion with a lot still to go. A historian writing him up 100 years from now might even throw in the fact that he won a Pulitzer Prize. That was in the 1960s when he owned a publication called the Omaha Sun, and it did a big expose of how the administrators of Boys Town were squandering the huge donations coming into the institution. That was thanks to Mickey Rooney and the movies Boys Town, rather than spending them wisely and kindly on the boys who lived in the home. So you've already heard that I wrote about Carly Fiorina in 2005. I got to know her well because my editor called me up while I was on vacation and, sounding a little desperate, asked me to take on a story about what we should definitively think of her. The question was particularly relevant for Fortune because 7 years earlier, starting our annual list of the most powerful women, the team doing the list, to which I wasn't connected, had reached down into the executive ranks of Lucent Technologies and put Carly, rather flabbergastingly, in the number one position on the list. In other words, she was unknown, and we made her famous. Without a doubt, that celebrity got her the job of CEO of Hewlett-Packard 2 years later. Then she made a highly controversial acquisition of computer company Compaq and entered into a number of years where she did not produce sterling results for Hewlett-Packard. So here was my boss on the phone saying, "Tell us what to think about Carly." 2 months later, after 3 interviews with Carly and many other interviews too, I wrote a story called Why Carly's Big Bet is Failing. The big bet being her acquisition of Compaq. You've heard a few lines from it. The Wall Street Journal simultaneously published a downbeat story on her, and 2 weeks later, the HP board fired her. It's impossible to say whether the 2 stories contributed to her firing, but I wouldn't think they could have helped. I've had 1 call from a TV booking agent asking me to go on a news show and comment about Carly. I said no because I'm just not up to date on her, and it wouldn't be fair for me to act like I am. But when I went back and reread my piece, there seemed a couple of stories, in addition to the ones already read, particularly relevant to a presidential campaign. I talked in the piece about her superlative marketing skills and said she was, quote, extraordinarily and amazingly articulate in all settings. Most other CEOs grope at least occasionally for words. She never seems to. But there is a downside to her verbal skills, and the what she is saying so fluently sometimes wears thin with people, coming off as short of substance, overly aspirational, and lacking in spontaneity. End of quote. Could Carly gain the Republican presidential nomination? I doubt it. My guess is that her real goal is the vice presidential nomination. But I'm sure she remains thrilled by every bit of presidential attention she's getting. And let me throw in a separate wild card thought. Could Mike Bloomberg, Mayor Mike of New York City, whom I wrote about at 2 different stages of his remarkable history and got to know well, could he emerge from the shadows and make a run at the Republican nomination? I wouldn't count that out. As a finale, let me go back to the students here who will be moving out this year or next into the job market. In the first place, let me congratulate any of you who have focused persistently on perfecting your writing skills. They will serve you well in any occupation. When Warren Buffett holds Q&A sessions for business school students in Omaha, which he does regularly, he always stresses that learning to communicate well, both in writing and orally, is essential for occupational success. One of his favorite anecdotes about himself concerns how terrified he was as a young man of public speaking. He signed up once for a Dale Carnegie public speaking course and then forfeited his $100 deposit, a lot of money in those days, because he was too terrified to go. He made himself sign up a second time, and this time went, discovering immediately that all the students around him were equally and pitifully scared. But that course, he says today, changed his life, turning him into a man who could speak without fear. In his office, there is only one diploma, that from the Dale Carnegie School of Public Speaking. As for specific jobs you might get, I will tell you what I told my own 2 children and am now telling the oldest, my 4 grandchildren. My advice is to look for a company or organization you really want to work for, and initially not to worry greatly about how overqualified you are for the job or how much you get paid. Most fields of work are meritocracies. Certainly journalism is. And if you work hard and well, you will get promoted. My second piece of advice, and it may sound small and frivolous, but it isn't, is find out what time your boss gets in to work in the morning and get in earlier. So thank you very much for listening, and I stand ready for any questions. You're very welcome.
Would you feel like you would entertain some
I
questions?
certainly would, and if anybody has any to ask, be delighted.
If anybody does have questions for Carol and would wish to set up a microphone, it is here for the youth, and obviously she's very generous about considering any concerns you might have. And as she said, you are what she once was. So obviously, some respect from you. I think I have one to start.
Okay.
Wondering because you. Oh, it doesn't seem to be working.
Is it on?
Yes, now it's on. You are talking about communication skills, obviously, and clearly you have them in abundance. And it seems like you found yourself in a position where you could use the unique conflation of those skills with an understanding of things in business. But I'm wondering, did you, in any formal way, study economics in your own career, undergraduate career?
No, that's a good question. I had one economics course, Basic Economics 101, when I was at Drury College, and we used to call it Dr. Black's Mystery Hour. And I must say, I got nothing. I do remember the law of supply and demand, and if you're going to remember one thing, that's probably the best to remember. But I had none, and fortune taught me economics. Well, I'm not Ben Bernanke economics, but it taught me finance, and all you had to do was apply yourself, and particularly when you were running, as I was for a little while, the Fortune 500, and so you picked it an awful lot up at that. And I was just generally interested in it. There's just no question. I'm so lucky that time and life turned me down and that fortune liked me because I was cut out for this work.
So when you were speaking about the significance of curiosity as a fundamental attribute for a writer or journalist, you feel like your own curiosity almost could have been applied to any field, maybe, including this one, and it landed on this one?
Well, I don't think I would have been a very good doctor. Or I think I was cut out for this work, and the sense of curiosity really has stuck with me. I love to know about people, and I know all about that driver who drove me up here today. And I know a lot about Bard since I've been here. I just think that curiosity is the one thing a journalist cannot get along without.
So helpful, thank you.
I have a question about whether or not you think pursuing a master's degree in either journalism or some type of written arts thing is useful. Because from what the little bit I've heard you tell us about your career, it kind of sounds like you learned everything on your own, and that maybe that's how you developed, your unique voice, and that's how you were able to become so successful. So I was wondering if you had any advice for us.
I'm afraid I'm not going to be a very good person on that. I would think there's some master's programs that would be terrific. And I admire the fact that you're a liberal arts school here. And now, the University of Missouri required, when you were in journalism school, which was your junior and senior years, that you have half of your credits from liberal arts, which I thought was wonderful. I don't know what to tell you about the masters. Depends on the kid, I think. So I just don't know. But if you really want to do that, I suspect you'll pull an awful lot from it, and you should go ahead and do it.
Having worked with one company for 60 years, what do you think is like the advantage or disadvantage of working with one organization for that long?
Well, I think I was lucky in being able to do that without having to worry much. My husband had a good job on Wall Street. When my first child was born, when my second child was born, and we moved to the suburbs, I went in and I said, I don't believe that I can work 12 months a year, and I wonder, would you let me take 3 months off in the summer, or if not, I'll quit and freelance. Well, by that time, they were willing to let me take 3 months off in the summer. So my 60 years, when I think about it, I always have to admit that it probably wasn't 60 years in elapsed time, because I had these summer vacations, which was pretty nice. But I think if you end up in the right place and you find yourself getting the promotions that you want, and you're having a good time, and every day you go into work and say, I'm so glad I'm here, I think staying in one place is fine. If you don't, and it's much more the way it works these days, you move some other place, hoping to move up. So I think it depends on the job and, again, the person.
I was just curious, how were you able to maintain relationships with people in the financial sector while also maintaining the accuracy of your reporting?
Well, so you mean just in general, all the people that I make friends with out there? Well, I think they knew that when I was there with a mission to interview them and get the right stuff for the story. And I must say that I told you about the David Rockefeller story. After that story came out, the 3-year deadline at David's bank. It was pretty tough on Chase, and David Rockefeller wrote his executives at Chase a memo and said the story was pretty tough, but it was fair. And I believe that that is what got me through more than anything, is that I tried very hard to be fair, even when I was being critical, because usually there's a second side to a story, and if you read a story that seems to give you only one side, you normally should be very suspicious of it. So I think that what got me through with my friendships with people was that I was fair, and they knew how thorough I was, because I tried extremely hard to be thorough.
Kind of going off of that question, earlier you said that the reporter/researcher was primarily responsible for the accuracy of the piece. I was wondering if you could elaborate.
Well,
it's
a very good question, because that was the way it worked at Fortune and at Time Magazine, was that if there was an error, an out-and-out error in a story, and there had been a researcher assigned to it, it was the researcher who was responsible rather than the writer. When I got to be a writer, maybe it was because I had gone through that researcher training, I could never leave aside the thought that it was anybody's responsibility but mine. And so I was very particular about accuracy, and I think I can remember every mistake I made, including one was spelling Buffett wrong, and the first time I ever mentioned his name. And so I don't think it is possible for a good writer to throw off the responsibility for accuracy to a person working with them. It just doesn't work that way. And I'm sorry to say that not everybody agrees with me on that. But at any rate, if you had a first draft of a story, you would start to literally check every word to make sure that every word was correct. And then when you didn't think it was, you would go to the writer and you would argue. You would occasionally go to the chief of research, but that was a far out thing to do, and you tried very hard not to do it. And you tried to get, when you were sure that something was wrong, you tried to get your opinion to overrule the writer's. And most of the time you did, but I can think of a couple of times where I didn't quite succeed. It was pretty awful. Anyway, it's a good question.
Hello? Okay, sorry. Can you hear me? Okay. This is more of an opinion kind of question, but I'm graduating in December and I'm starting to apply to like editorial kind of internships. And I was wondering, in your opinion, do you think it's, I don't know, like damaging to kind of dabble in different kinds of publishers that do different kinds of things? Or do you think it would be, or was it more beneficial to stay kind of with one company and then, you know, keep networking through that instead of trying different things?
I want to be sure I understood you. Do you mean the number of different places you interview, or the...
No.
You get a job.
Yeah.
Should you stay with them?
Like,
Well-
would you think it's okay to kind of jump around, not because you don't like that job necessarily, but to keep moving around, or would that kind of ruin the long-term networking?
Well, I think networking is good. I hope you get a job that you like enough so that you don't have to do that. But,
No, that's what I mean, that I would like, but in case
But,
you want to try something
well,
else.
I think you can also learn from other places if you have a chance to do that, and sometimes you do by talking to friends who work at other places. But you also don't want your boss to hear that you're out there looking for a job,
Right.
and lose the one you've got. So, there's one. I think there's one.
Okay,
back.
hi. I'm a returning student, and I actually am from the other side of, I've been a publicist since '89.
Uh-huh.
And my question is not about getting a job, but more about what you think about, and it's probably a big, big question, but magazines are changing. Having a career in print is changing. What do you think in terms of, what do you think is happening in the industry with regards to print publications as they become, there are bigger brands like Fortune that seem to survive, but, what do you think is happening, and is there going to be print magazines in 10 years?
Well, I think that really is a good question, a big question. And I don't think I know the answer. Obviously, every publication today is not only into print, but also into the internet. But we have Fortune.com. Advertising placed on the internet, you do not get the revenue, the income from it that you do from a page in the magazine. So automatically you're behind on that advertising is just not as profitable for you. It's changing all the time, because I don't think that people know how much they're getting out of their internet advertising. I look at some of the advertising there and I think myself, does this really work? Now, I hope they have some reason to think that it does. There is a form of article, I was talking earlier to someone here, called listicle. Do you know about listicles? Yeah. A listicle is an article that is based on a list. 5 things to do when you go to Greenwich Village next week. 10 reasons to get really mad at Donald Trump. Listicles, the demand for listicles from editors is huge. You can spend all your life this next year thinking of good topics for listicles, and you could go right into a job, maybe writing them. But they're not that satisfying. So I left about the time that we got a new managing editor who wanted a lot of listicles. I left before he came, and I'm glad I did, because I think I would have had a hard time. A listicle is a long way from a in-depth 6,000 or 7,000 word article. And so I think magazines I think it's a hard row to hoe, that some are doing better than others, and that 10 years from now, some of those are going to have failed. And you look at Time magazine, very good to read, but it's awfully thin. The women's magazines are, in many cases, still quite thick. But even you look at People, sometimes kind of thin. So it's not easy, and I think that there's there's going to be a lot of residue out there at some point, but I don't know which magazines are going to make it and which aren't.
Thank you. Ms. Loomis, I'm just curious as to roughly how many drafts you usually go through or went through per article.
Well, I probably am not totally typical of other writers. I never got a way of writing that seems to be used by many other people, which is that they do a whole draft and then go back and redo it. I had to get my first paragraph just right, then I had to move into my second paragraph, where I would find out that my first paragraph wasn't just right. So then I would go back, and this was going back to the age of typewriters. I would have to type the first paragraph, because I couldn't stand for it to be messy. And then I would eventually get to the second paragraph, third paragraph, and eventually I would have 25 paragraphs that suited me, or maybe more for those long stories. And I would now be at a first draft stage. But I had editors tell me that my first drafts seemed more like them to like what would happen to a third draft for some writers, because I couldn't stand to turn in anything that didn't fit my own standards. So I would eventually, even when I was trying to turn in a perfect first draft, which is impossible to do, really, I would have maybe 3 drafts, and then we would go to what we call local, which was where you could see what the page was going to look like. So, but I mean, you could have, on some occasion, I'm sure some writers had 6 drafts. And then, of course, when the internet came in, you could make all those corrections so easily, and you didn't have to retype those paragraphs. That was a great time saver.
So you've been talking about your career very fondly. You've been saying a lot of very fun words about how much fun you were having, and I'm really an advocate of where's the fun in there? I'm really curious as to what part of your career was either the most fun or the most fulfilling.
Well, it's a lot of fun to interview interesting people. I hope I heard your question. I think I did. Interviewing is wonderful fun. To be able to ask somebody who's had an outstanding career in business, and how they did it, and what are they doing with their company right now, and what is this weakness that looks to me like that's just great fun. The writing is not fun. Maybe you've noticed that. It's an awfully lot of fun to have written. And it's fun to see your story in print, and to have letters come in, and to even have some of your predictions turn out right. In 2006, I wrote a story about General Motors, in which I said that it was going to go bankrupt. I said not in 2006, but down the road a little bit. Well, I think I didn't make it far enough down the road, but it went bankrupt. And a few people wrote me letters, wrote me emails saying, "I remember." Now next week, the Fortune Most Powerful Women Conference is going to be held. And we invite one man, Warren Buffett, and I interview him each year. And this year I'm also going to interview Mary Barra, the CEO of General Motors. And that's going to be interesting, because I really know a lot about General Motors, having written that story. So the writing, it's just awfully hard work. But when you get it done right, when you get a paragraph done right, when you get a story done right, that is the sense of accomplishment there is almost unlike anything else that I have known as far as accomplishment.
Carol, can I ask, you're obviously a self-made woman in so many ways. I think that the advantage of this generation is that they generally have models. But you as a pioneer, I'm wondering, did you have any models at all? Like how did you manage to think this is possible beyond just relying on, being so self-reliant as you obviously are?
Well, I was always, I mentioned that I worked with these senior writers and listened to them ask their questions and think, oh, how can I ever do that? And I was always a reader. I was a reader from age 4 on. And so I think I had models without really realizing they were models. I just, I thought that I don't think there's anything better than reading to teach you how to write, because you see how people do it. And so I can't think whether I had any real models outside of some of the writers that I was seeing at Fortune who I thought were very good.
Okay, I'll try to make it a good one. My other question to you is a challenge for me today as a publicist is there are a lot of blogs out there, and I think it's great that people start their own media outlet to try and write and make themselves, but I find that the integrity between journalist and publicist, or journalist and news person who's distributing news, is devolving. It seems like many of these indie publications or DIY publications or blogs are asking for money for articles. And I've been asked many times when I'm sending out a press release, oh, you need to pay me $25 to print your story. This is disheartening, because it's my hope that journalists continue to have integrity and choose to write about things that are interesting. Do you see this, and do you have advice for how to maintain this kind of integrity in the industry when so many people haven't been trained or know or are upholding that, or that seems to be devolving
Well,
to some extent?
I didn't know about, I'm really sorry to hear that people are asking for money to print your story. And I guess that's part of what they now call native advertising, although I've never been quite clear of that, about that definition. Well, first of all, you didn't specifically ask about this, but I think a lot of the stuff that's put on the internet is just bunk. It's words that fill up some space, and certainly every online site needs words to fill up space, because they're trying to tell the advertisers, we have all these good words, and here, so come to this, do your advertising at this site. But there's always been a lack of integrity in parts of journalism. It sounds to me like, from what you say, that it's really expanded, and I'm awfully sorry to hear it. And I didn't know that was one of the things that good PR people were having to deal with these days. That's terrible. Sorry. No, it's not.
Any final questions, or? Yes.
At what point do you let a story go? I mean, my daughter has been published, and she's written many, many times. She'd go up something 8, 9, 10 times. Finally, she said, it may not be perfect, but it's gone. And I'm just wondering, at what point do you feel the story is sufficiently complete to let it go?
Well, you may run into a deadline, and that can be pretty important in making you decide that this story is going to have to go. Well, you use all the time you can if you think it's an imperfect story. You spend nights, and I literally have spent many nights. John Curran spent nights when he was working at Fortune. If you had a story going to press and you were unhappy with what it said, or you thought it was inaccurate, there was no amount of time that you wouldn't use to try to make it better. I think that is the hallmark of every good writer and editor, that you are trying to put a perfect story out there, as hard as it is. But I think that maybe the question is, the deadline comes and you can't work on it any longer, so that's when you let it go.
Which is excellent advice for all of the senior project people in the room who know that April 30th they will be done. Carol, thank you so very much for all your gracious.
Thank you.